Hey everybody, welcome back to our channel. Today's video is going to be another true crime video, and I'm starting this video out on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We're going to talk about a 16-year-old murder that has become a cold case. This is the story of IRA Yarmolenko. Before we start talking about this case, I wanted to tell you that while I was out filming for this video, I took a lot of footage of plants, flowers, and nature that caught my eye. Nature photography was one of IRA's real passions, and this is my little way of paying a tribute to her. Also, I would like to share that this case is incredibly complex, and there is quite a lot of public information online about the details of the final day of IRA's life and the court battles that ensued afterwards. I have omitted a lot of this information just for the sake of the length of this video, but I've provided as many links below in the description box as I can to articles, blogs, and YouTube videos, and if you're interested and would like to learn even more, please check those out. Irina Yarmolenko, known as IRA by her friends and family, was a 19-year-old college student at the University of North Carolina in the spring of 2008. She and her family had immigrated as refugees to the United States from the Ukraine when she was 8 years old, and she had grown up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. IRA has been described by her family as having a sunny spirit and a quick smile, and she made friends everywhere she went. She played piano and tennis, and she was a member of a Russian club. She loved to travel and learn about other cultures. She enjoyed photography and being outdoors, and she especially loved to take photographs of nature and landscapes. She was involved in extracurricular activities at UNCC and was working part-time in the student union as a computer assistant and occasionally writing for the student newspaper. She was kind-hearted and talked frequently about finding things to do to help other people and make their lives easier or better. She had recently decided to transfer her education to UNC Chapel Hill in order to move back home closer to her parents and pursue a major in public health. On May 5th, 2008, just 3 days after her 20th birthday, IRA was finishing up final exams at UNCC and doing some last-minute errands to prepare for her move back to Chapel Hill. She took one of her final exams at UNCC that morning at 9:45 a.m. Afterwards, she left campus, and surveillance cameras at businesses around town silently captured her movements throughout the rest of the morning. No one could possibly know that she would never make it to her last exam scheduled for that evening at 5 p.m., or that this would be the last day of IRA's life. At 10:18 a.m., IRA was seen on closed-circuit cameras stopping at a credit union to either deposit or withdraw cash. 15 minutes later, she was seen at a nearby Goodwill donating multiple bags of soft fabric assumed to be clothes. She also attempted to donate a pillow, which Goodwill rejected, and she placed the pillow in the back of her car. She then drove a couple of miles back towards the college and was seen on camera stopping in at a local coffee shop called Jackson's Java, where she had once worked, to say goodbye to her friends and coworkers and give gifts to the people she would miss. Jackson's Java is no longer in business, but it used to be located in this shopping center, which is just across the road from UNCC. From here, she drove about 12 miles west of Charlotte towards the town of Belmont. Her first stop was at a family-owned YMCA in Belmont, where an ex-boyfriend of hers had worked, although allegedly he was not at work on this particular day. When she pulled out of the Belmont YMCA parking lot, headed towards the nearby Catawba River at 11:09 a.m., this was the last known recorded appearance of her car on surveillance cameras. It's generally assumed that IRA went from the YMCA to the river of her own volition, most likely to take pictures of the river and beautiful nature scenery. But unfortunately, even with the intervention of NASA to try to enhance the video footage, It was never able to be determined if IRA was the person driving her car or how many people might also be in the car with her. Meanwhile, a few hundred feet down the river, two cousins were out fishing on this beautiful spring day. Neil Casada and Mark Carver had grown up together, raised 4 children each, and lived very close to each other. Both men were disabled at this point in life and could no longer work. Casada had such severe heart and respiratory problems he could only walk a few feet before becoming so short of breath he had to sit down. Carver had nerve damage from debilitating carpal tunnel syndrome and a botched surgical repair. He has very limited fine motor skills and can hardly button his own shirts in the morning. Neither one of the men were physically capable of grasping or carrying heavy items. In addition, Carver has limited mental capacity. Both men loved to fish, and the Catawba riverbank offered plenty of great spots to throw in a line and rest on the bank while waiting for something to take a bite. Shortly before 1:00 p.m., 2 jet skiers in the Catawba River noticed a dark blue Saturn sedan pointed down the embankment towards the river, seeming to be stuck on a tree stump or log. The driver's door was open, and a young woman lay on her back a few feet from the car, motionless. There were 3 cords knotted around her neck, and the weeds around the open car door were trampled flat, although no footprints were found. The jet skiers left in 2 different directions to summon help, which ultimately resulted in both Belmont and Mount Holly police departments becoming involved in the investigation. The crime scene attracted a lot of attention that day, bringing in police from 2 different municipalities, news crews, spectators, and helicopters. Police questioned anyone they could find anywhere near the scene, including Neil Casada and Mark Carver. Officers shook hands with the men and checked their identification and their fishing licenses without gloves on. Both men denied involvement in the homicide from the beginning and never wavered in their assertion that they had not seen or heard anything suspicious that day. Carver and Casada expressed open willingness to participate in the investigation and help out in any way that they could, even agreeing to do video interviews. Casada took a polygraph test and passed. Carver offered to do a polygraph but was dismissed by police. Both men submitted to cheek swabs for DNA, and they cooperated with police at every turn. An autopsy was performed on IRA's body the day after her death and concluded that she had died of the results of the 3 ligatures that were tied around her neck. 2, if not all 3 of the ligatures had come from the inside of her own car, and any one of the 3 would have been sufficient to cause her to pass out within a few seconds. There was no way she could have tied all 3 of them by herself. The first ligature to be tied around her neck was a blue ribbon that had been ripped off of her purse. The second was the drawstring ripped out of her hoodie, and the third ligature was a cord that had been attached to her car's radio. Ultimately, police evaluated and eliminated 8 suspects, but months dragged on with no clear answers. Then, in December, 7 months after IRA was deceased, news broke that the DNA results were back, and they incriminated both Mark Carver and Neil Casada. A DNA match from both men was found in swabs taken from 3 different locations on the outside of IRA's car. In news footage of their arrests, both men were visibly stunned. The cutting edge in science at the time of Carver's and Casada's arrests was what we now call touch DNA, in which only a few skin cells are enough to obtain a DNA profile. Most people would assume that DNA evidence is the most convincing and convicting power that could ever possibly exist. Once there's a DNA match, the matter is then settled, done, never to be questioned again. Few people would know that touch DNA comes with risks and warning bells. Small amounts of skin cells or sweat can easily transfer from one person to another with a handshake or another form of contact, and then be transferred by this second person onto a third person, a victim, or something nearby. Samples containing a mix of DNA create particular challenges. and all 3 samples taken from Ira's car showed a mix of more than one contributor. In addition, DNA taken from the bungee cord around Ira's neck revealed DNA from an unidentified person that matched neither Carver nor Casada. In his now famous videotaped interrogation, Mark Carver denied any involvement in Ira's death more than 50 times. Before the case went to trial, the prosecution offered Carver and Casada a deal: plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of 8 to 14 years in prison, which would probably be lowered to even less than that. That's a pretty sweet deal for a murder charge. However, Carver and Casada refused over and over again, consistently and adamantly insisting that they did not kill Ira, they did not touch Ira, and they were never anywhere near her car. Their story never wavered or changed even once. Interestingly, the bond for both cousins was mysteriously lowered from $1 million to just $100,000 in February of 2009, and both men quietly returned home to await their day in trial. Tragically, Neil Casada never made it to trial and never had the chance to defend his innocence in court. The Sunday morning before he was due to appear in court, he collapsed and died of a heart attack. His family is convinced that the stress of the impending trial was too much for his already weak heart condition, and his death left his cousin Mark Carver to face the murder charges alone. In March 2011, Mark Carver's trial began, and his defense attorneys considered the prosecution's case to be a really weak one. The attorneys assumed that surely the jury would be able to see the holes in the case presented by the prosecution and how little evidence there really was against their client. However, at trial, no one presented a less sinister explanation for how Carver and Casada's DNA got onto Ira's car. Video evidence was not presented that showed multiple investigators, who were not wearing gloves, shaking hands with Carver and Casada and examining their fishing licenses before going back to the crime scene to touch and investigate Ira's car. Other issues brought up in court and worth investigating further, if you're interested, surround the police interrogation of Mark Carver, in which he, being of limited mental capacity, was clearly being led or coached by the police officers to give specific answers to their questions about how tall Ira is. Mark Carver himself is only an inch taller than Ira was, and the officer interrogating Carver demonstrated with his hands how tall Ira was, before asking Carver to also indicate how tall she was. When Carver mimicked the police officer and held his hands at the approximate height that Ira stood, the police then used this gesture as an aha moment to somehow prove that Carver must have stood next to her to commit the murder, and clearly he must have known how tall she was, despite the fact that Carver continued to insist that he had never seen Ira once in his life. The trial lasted for 5 days, and the jury deliberated for a total of 5 hours before Mark Carver was convicted of first-degree murder on March 21, 2011. He was sentenced to life in prison. There has been significant public and legal debate ever since over the evidence, over the lack of evidence, and how the entire case was handled. Mark Carver went on to spend over a decade in prison, convicted of a murder that I personally do not believe he committed. He was the first case involving touch DNA to go before the NC Court of Appeals, but the court denied his appeal in 2012. In 2019, a judge overturned his conviction, ruling that the defense team had been ineffective and that DNA evidence that could have exonerated Casada and Carver was not properly presented at trial. However, it was not until a change in district attorney in 2022 that charges against Carver were officially fully dismissed, when it was determined by the new DNA that there was not sufficient DNA evidence to meet the modern standard necessary for conviction. In August of 2022, all charges against Mark Carver were dropped, and Carver was allowed to walk free after spending over a decade in prison for a crime that he did not commit. However, to this day, Carver has never received a pardon of innocence or been compensated in any way for the time he spent behind bars. Carver's sister-in-law, spokesperson for the family, has publicly stated that nobody has been held accountable. There have been no apologies, no closure whatsoever. Alright everybody, if you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed this video. I think I made it no secret that I personally believe that Neil Casada and Mark Carver had nothing to do with IRA's murder. But it does not sit well with me that whoever did kill her is still out there. He's gone unpunished all of these years. He could be anybody that I pass on the street any day of the week. And I would like to see, for IRA's sake and for the sake of her family, that that person get brought to justice. But that's going to wrap up this video, everybody. Thank you for watching. I'll see you another day in another video. Bye, everybody.